Nobody believed the radio waves could travel that far through enemy fire. The communications blackout had lasted 14 hours, and Fort Riverside's entire battalion was trapped in Eagle Valley with no way to call for air support or reinforcements. Command had written them off as lost. The enemy offensive was closing in from 3 directions, and without coordinated defense, 800 soldiers would be overrun by dawn. But as the first enemy artillery shells began falling on the outer perimeter, a single figure emerged from the communications bunker, carrying equipment that wasn't supposed to work and heading toward terrain that wasn't supposed to be survivable. Tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the mountainside like smoke from a dying fire wrapping around. The concrete barriers and razor wire that marked the perimeter of Fort Riverside. The base sat carved into the rocky face of the mountain, a collection of weathered buildings and communication towers that had stood sentinel over Eagle Valley for 23 years. From the highest observation deck, you could see the entire strategic pass stretched out below, a narrow corridor of green forest and gray stone that connected the northern supply routes to the southern strongholds. Sarah Martinez stood at the edge of the communications compound, her boots silent on the frost-covered gravel. At 5 feet 2 inches and barely 115 pounds, she moved through the early morning shadows like a whisper, checking connections on the relay equipment that most soldiers walked past without a second glance. Her hands worked with the precision of someone who understood that every wire, every frequency, every signal could mean the difference between coordination and chaos. She wore standard issue fatigues that hung loose on her small frame, the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms marked with tiny scars from years of working with sharp-edged electronics. The other soldiers barely noticed her presence. She had become part of the landscape, another piece of equipment that kept the base running but never commanded attention. When she walked past groups of soldiers heading to the mess hall, conversations continued without pause. When she worked late into the night fine-tuning radio frequencies, the duty officers assumed she was just another technician doing routine maintenance. Nobody questioned why she was always the first to arrive at the communications center, or why she stayed long after her shift ended, studying signal patterns and memorizing backup protocols that hadn't been used in 15 years. Inside the main communications bunker, the walls were lined with banks of radio equipment, signal processors, and monitoring devices that hummed with constant electronic chatter. Multiple screens displayed frequency readings, weather patterns, and tactical overlays of the surrounding terrain. Sarah moved between the workstations with quiet efficiency, adjusting settings that other technicians had left slightly off calibration, replacing components that were beginning to show signs of wear, upgrading connections that could fail under stress. Her supervisor, Staff Sergeant Alex Turner, often found equipment running better after Sarah's shifts, but he attributed it to routine maintenance rather than exceptional skill. The base operated on a rhythm that had been established over decades of military presence in the region. Morning briefings at 0600, equipment checks at 0730, communication drills at noon, and evening reports before sunset. Sarah participated in all of it, but always from the background, always in support roles that kept her invisible to the decision-makers who determined unit assignments and mission responsibilities. She had requested transfer to field operations 17 times in the past 2 years. Each request had been politely denied with variations of the same reasoning: insufficient field experience, below optimal physical requirements, better utilized in current technical capacity. Colonel James Parker ran Fort Riverside with the efficiency of a man who had spent 30 years learning that military success depended on putting the right people in the right positions. He was a fair commander, respected by his officers and trusted by his enlisted personnel, but he made decisions based on established protocols and proven metrics. When Sarah had first requested assignment to Alpha Company's infantry unit, he had reviewed her file with genuine consideration. Her technical scores were exceptional, her reliability ratings were perfect, and her knowledge of communications equipment was superior to soldiers with twice her experience. But she was also 50 pounds lighter than the minimum recommended weight for combat operations and had never completed advanced field training. Sergeant Mike Thompson, who led Alpha Company's 1st Platoon, had been blunt in his assessment when Colonel Parker asked for his opinion. Thompson had served in 3 combat zones and lost soldiers to circumstances that might have been prevented by better physical preparedness. He wasn't being cruel when he told the colonel that Sarah would be a liability in field operations, just realistic about the demands of infantry combat. His soldiers carried equipment loads that exceeded Sarah's total body weight, operated in terrain that required climbing ability she had never demonstrated, and faced physical confrontations where size and strength could determine survival. Thompson respected Sarah's technical abilities, but he had to think about the safety of his entire unit. Similar conversations had taken place with the leaders of every specialized unit on the base. Captain Lisa Chun, who commanded the logistics coordination team, appreciated Sarah's organizational skills but felt she lacked the leadership presence necessary for field logistics operations. Lieutenant Tom Wilson, who ran the artillery specialists, acknowledged her mathematical precision but questioned whether she could handle the physical demands of mobile artillery deployment. Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez, who supervised the medical unit, recognized Sarah's steady hands and calm demeanor, but worried that her small stature would prevent her from carrying wounded soldiers to safety. Each rejection had been delivered with professional courtesy and genuine regret. Sarah received detailed explanations of the requirements for each unit, recommendations for additional training that might improve her qualifications, and encouragement to continue her excellent work in communications support. But the underlying message was always the same. She was valuable where she was, and attempting to place her in field operations would be unfair to both her and the soldiers who would depend on her. Sarah accepted each rejection without argument or complaint. She listened to the explanations, thanked the officers for their consideration, and returned to her duties without any change in her performance or attitude. But late at night, when the base had settled into the quiet rhythms of shift changes and security patrols, she could be found in the communications center studying tactical manuals that weren't part of her official responsibilities. She memorized the radio frequencies used by every unit on the base, learned the communication protocols for joint operations with air support and artillery coordination, and practiced emergency procedures for situations that her supervisors assumed would never involve her. Dr. Emma Foster, the civilian engineer who maintained the base's communication infrastructure, often worked these same late hours when equipment upgrades required minimal radio traffic. She began to notice Sarah's presence during these quiet periods, observing the young soldier's careful attention to details that most technicians considered optional. Emma had 30 years of experience with military communication systems, and she recognized exceptional talent when she saw it. She began leaving technical manuals and advanced repair procedures where Sarah would find them, never explicitly assigning additional training, but making resources available for someone motivated to learn. The relationship between Dr. Foster and Sarah developed without formal acknowledgement. Emma would mention complex signal propagation problems while Sarah was working nearby, describing theoretical solutions that pushed the boundaries of standard equipment capabilities. Sarah would listen without comment, but days later, Emma would find equipment configurations that implemented exactly the innovations they had discussed. When civilian contractors struggled with signal interference problems that had puzzled them for weeks, Emma would suggest consulting with the technician who worked the night shift, and Sarah would quietly provide solutions that resolved issues no one else had been able to diagnose. This pattern of informal mentorship continued for months, with Sarah absorbing advanced technical knowledge that far exceeded the requirements of her official position. She learned to modify standard radio equipment for extended range, to route signals through alternative pathways when primary systems failed, and to maintain communications in environmental conditions that would disable conventional setups. Emma never formally documented this additional training, but she began to rely on Sarah's expertise for increasingly complex problems that arose during routine maintenance and equipment upgrades. The base's daily operations continued with the predictable efficiency that Colonel Parker had established over his 3 years of command. Morning reports confirmed that all units were at full readiness. Equipment status checks showed all systems functioning within normal parameters, and communication drills demonstrated that Fort Riverside maintained reliable contact with regional command and allied positions throughout Eagle Valley. The soldiers settled into routines that balanced training requirements with operational preparedness, and the base maintained its reputation as one of the most efficiently run installations in the mountain region. Sarah's role in maintaining this efficiency remained invisible to most of the base personnel. When radio equipment functioned flawlessly during training exercises, soldiers assumed it was the result of good military hardware and proper maintenance procedures. When communication links remained stable during weather conditions that should have caused interference, officers credited the base's excellent infrastructure and strategic positioning. When backup systems activated seamlessly during routine testing, commanders noted the reliability of their equipment without considering the careful preparation that ensured such smooth operations. But Dr. Foster noticed, and she began to document patterns that suggested Fort Riverside's communication capabilities exceeded the standards that should have been possible with their assigned equipment and personnel. Signal strength readings consistently surpassed manufacturer specifications. Frequency coordination between units operated with precision that eliminated interference issues common at other installations, and backup protocols functioned with efficiency that suggested extensive testing and optimization. Emma realized that someone was providing maintenance and upgrades that went far beyond standard procedures, and she began to understand that Sarah's technical abilities represented a resource that the base command had never fully recognized. The weather patterns over Eagle Valley had been shifting throughout the autumn, with fog banks rolling in from the western ridges earlier each day and staying longer into the morning hours. The meteorological station reported atmospheric conditions that could interfere with radio communications, particularly at the higher frequencies used for coordination with air support and artillery units. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Standard protocols called for switching to backup communication systems during severe weather, but Sarah had been quietly modifying the backup equipment to maintain reliability, even when atmospheric interference reached levels that would normally disrupt all radio traffic. Private Ryan Brooks, one of the youngest soldiers assigned to Fort Riverside, had been struggling with basic radio operation procedures since his arrival 6 weeks earlier. His training scores were adequate, but he lacked the intuitive understanding of radio equipment that experienced soldiers developed over time. Sarah had noticed his difficulties during routine communication drills and began providing informal assistance when their shifts overlapped. She showed him techniques for adjusting antenna positioning to improve signal clarity, explained how to recognize and compensate for atmospheric interference, and taught him troubleshooting procedures that weren't covered in standard training manuals. Ryan appreciated Sarah's patient instruction, but he also noticed that her knowledge of radio systems seemed to extend far beyond what would be expected from someone in a support position. She understood signal propagation theory, frequency management, and equipment modification techniques that he had only heard discussed by senior technicians and communications officers. When he asked about her background, Sarah explained that she had studied electronics before joining the military, but Ryan suspected there was more to her expertise than civilian education could explain. The first signs of unusual enemy activity in the region appeared on satellite reconnaissance images that were analyzed at Regional Command Headquarters, 50 miles south of Fort Riverside. Intelligence reports indicated increased movement along traditional infiltration routes, with convoy patterns that suggested preparation for coordinated operations rather than routine patrol activities. The information was shared with Fort Riverside through standard intelligence briefings, but the threat assessment remained at normal levels because the enemy forces appeared to be positioned for defensive operations rather than aggressive advancement. Colonel Parker reviewed the intelligence reports with his senior staff during their weekly planning meeting, noting the increased activity but maintaining current readiness levels based on the assessment that enemy forces were responding to their own intelligence rather than preparing for immediate offensive operations. The base continued normal training schedules and operational routines, with standard security protocols in place, but no heightened alert status that would indicate preparation for combat operations. Sarah learned about the intelligence reports through routine communication traffic that she monitored as part of her regular duties. Standard procedure required communications personnel to track message traffic for signs of equipment problems or signal degradation, and Sarah had developed the habit of paying attention to content patterns that might indicate developing situations requiring enhanced communication support. The reports about increased enemy activity caught her attention not because they suggested immediate danger, but because they indicated conditions that could require extended radio operations under potentially difficult circumstances. Over the following days, Sarah began preparing equipment modifications that would optimize radio performance for extended operations in challenging conditions. She tested alternative antenna configurations that would provide better signal propagation in mountainous terrain, verified backup power systems that could maintain communications during extended power outages, and prepared portable equipment packages that could be rapidly deployed if standard communication systems were damaged or destroyed. She performed this preparation quietly, without requesting authorization or drawing attention to activities that exceeded her official responsibilities. The enemy offensive began at 0300 on a Tuesday morning with coordinated strikes that targeted communication infrastructure throughout the Eagle Valley region. The attacks were precisely planned to disrupt coordination between allied positions, while creating conditions that would allow rapid advancement through the strategic mountain passes that Fort Riverside was positioned to defend. The first indication of the assault came from automated security sensors that detected movement along 3 separate approach routes, followed immediately by electromagnetic pulse detonations that disabled primary communication systems throughout the valley. Colonel Parker was awakened by emergency sirens and immediately rushed to the command center, where he found his staff struggling to assess the situation with severely limited information. Primary radio links to regional command had been severed. Satellite communication was experiencing interference that prevented reliable data transmission, and contact with allied positions throughout Eagle Valley had been lost. The base's internal communication systems were functioning, but they had no way to coordinate with external forces or to request air support and artillery assistance that would be essential for defending against a coordinated assault. Sarah was in the communications bunker when the electromagnetic pulse struck, working on routine maintenance that she performed during quiet overnight hours. The pulse disabled most of the electronic equipment instantly, but Sarah had been testing a modified radio configuration that included electromagnetic shielding based on specifications she had studied in Dr. Foster's advanced technical manuals. The shielded equipment survived the pulse, providing Fort Riverside with limited communication capability when all other bases in the region had been completely cut off from external contact. The initial reports that reached the command center painted a picture of a carefully planned assault designed to isolate Allied positions before overrunning them with superior numbers. Enemy forces had simultaneously struck communication installations, supply routes, and strategic positions throughout Eagle Valley, creating conditions that would prevent coordinated defense and make individual positions vulnerable to concentrated attacks. Fort Riverside's location made it a critical target because controlling the base would give enemy forces access to the primary mountain pass connecting northern and southern Allied territories. Staff Sergeant Alex Turner rushed to the communications bunker to assess the damage and found Sarah working with equipment that shouldn't have been functional after an electromagnetic pulse. She explained that the modified radio system could provide limited contact with nearby positions, but the range was severely restricted and the signal quality was poor enough that only basic information could be transmitted reliably. Turner immediately reported this capability to Colonel Parker, who realized that Sarah's equipment might represent Fort Riverside's only link to the outside world during the developing crisis. The situation deteriorated rapidly as enemy forces advanced along multiple routes toward the base perimeter. Without communication links to coordinate with Allied positions or to request air support, Colonel Parker had to prepare for defending Fort Riverside with only the 800 soldiers under his direct command. His officers reported that standard defensive protocols assumed communication support that was no longer available, leaving them to improvise coordination methods that had not been tested under combat conditions. The base's strategic position in the mountain pass made retreat impossible, so they would have to hold their ground against overwhelming odds, while hoping that regional command would recognize their situation and send reinforcements. Sarah listened to the tactical discussions from her position at the communication station, understanding that the base's survival depended on re-establishing contact with Allied forces who could provide air support and artillery coordination. The modified radio equipment could transmit over short distances, but reaching regional command would require signal relay through intermediate positions that might also be under attack. She began calculating transmission routes that could potentially reach Allied positions if relay stations could be established at strategic points throughout the valley. But the plan would require someone to manually position and operate relay equipment in locations that were likely to be under enemy fire. The morning brought confirmation that Fort Riverside was completely surrounded by enemy forces who had established positions along all major approach routes to the base. Reconnaissance patrols reported that escape routes had been blocked and that enemy artillery was being positioned for a coordinated assault that would begin once their forces had completed encirclement operations. Colonel Parker convened an emergency planning session with his senior staff to develop defensive strategies that could maximize their chances of survival until reinforcements arrived. But everyone understood that without communication links, regional command might not even know that Fort Riverside was under attack. The enemy assault began with artillery bombardment, designed to destroy defensive positions and communication infrastructure while creating chaos that would prevent coordinated resistance. The first shells struck the outer perimeter at dawn, followed by sustained bombardment that targeted specific buildings and equipment, installations identified through reconnaissance operations conducted over previous weeks. The communications center suffered direct hits that destroyed remaining conventional radio equipment, leaving Sarah's modified system as the base's only remaining link to potential outside assistance. Colonel Parker realized that conventional defensive strategies would not be sufficient to repel an assault by forces that outnumbered his garrison by more than 3-1. The base's survival would depend on calling for air support and artillery assistance that could disrupt enemy positions before they could complete their assault preparations. But requesting such assistance required communication capabilities that exceeded the range of Sarah's surviving equipment, unless someone could establish relay positions that would extend their signal transmission to reach Allied forces positioned outside the valley. Sarah approached Colonel Parker with a proposal that seemed impossible under the circumstances. She explained that radio signals could be relayed through a series of positions along the ridgeline surrounding Eagle Valley, potentially reaching Allied communication stations that were outside the electromagnetic interference zone created by the enemy's pulse weapons. The plan would require positioning relay equipment at 3 specific locations that she had identified through analysis of terrain features and signal propagation characteristics, but all 3 positions were in areas that would be exposed to enemy fire during the relay operations. The colonel listened to Sarah's technical explanation with growing understanding that her proposal might represent their only chance for survival. She described how portable radio equipment could be modified to function as relay stations, how signal timing could be coordinated to prevent interference between transmission stages, and how the relay chain could be operated by a single person, moving between positions if the equipment was properly configured. But Parker also realized that implementing the plan would require someone to carry equipment through terrain that was currently being contested by enemy forces, establishing relay positions under combat conditions, and maintaining the communication link long enough for effective coordination with outside assistance to be arranged. When Colonel Parker asked who could implement such a dangerous and technically complex operation, Sarah volunteered without hesitation. She explained that she had already prepared the necessary equipment modifications, memorized the terrain features required for optimal signal transmission, and calculated the timing sequences needed for effective relay coordination. Her small size would actually be an advantage for moving through difficult terrain without detection, and her technical expertise was essential for adjusting equipment configuration to compensate for changing atmospheric conditions and enemy interference attempts. The command staff initially resisted the proposal, arguing that Sarah lacked field combat experience and that sending a single soldier on such a dangerous mission would likely result in failure and casualties that the base could not afford. But as artillery bombardment intensified and enemy forces began advancing on the outer perimeter, it became clear that conventional defense strategies would not prevent the base from being overrun within hours. Sarah's communication relay plan represented their only realistic chance for survival, regardless of the risks involved in its implementation. Colonel Parker made the decision to authorize Sarah's mission while simultaneously ordering his remaining forces to prepare for final defensive positions around the base's core facilities. If Sarah could establish communication links with Allied forces, Fort Riverside might receive air support and reinforcements that could repel the enemy assault. If her mission failed, the base would continue fighting until ammunition was exhausted and positions were overrun, but at least they would have attempted every possible strategy for survival. Sarah gathered her equipment with calm efficiency, packing portable radio components, signal amplifiers, backup power supplies, and the technical notes she had prepared during months of studying advanced communication procedures. Her gear was lighter than standard field equipment because she had modified and optimized every component for maximum functionality with minimum weight, but she still carried enough technical capability to establish communication links that could reach Allied positions 50 miles away under optimal conditions. As enemy forces prepared for their final assault on Fort Riverside's defensive perimeter, Sarah slipped out of the base through a maintenance tunnel that emerged beyond the main defensive lines. She carried equipment that represented the base's last hope for survival, heading toward terrain that was controlled by enemy forces who would not hesitate to eliminate anyone attempting to interfere with their carefully planned assault. Behind her, 800 soldiers prepared to defend positions that could not be held without the outside assistance that only she could provide. The maintenance tunnel stretched into darkness ahead of Sarah, its concrete walls slick with condensation that had accumulated over decades of mountain weather. Emergency lighting strips provided just enough illumination to navigate the narrow passage, but beyond the exit point, She would be moving through terrain controlled by enemy forces, who had spent weeks studying every approach to Fort Riverside. Her modified radio equipment felt heavier with each step, not from physical weight, but from the understanding that 800 lives depended on her ability to establish communication links that military doctrine considered impossible under current conditions. The tunnel emerged behind a cluster of boulders approximately 400 meters from the base perimeter, positioning Sarah beyond the immediate defensive lines, but still within the broader area that enemy forces had surrounded during their overnight advancement. She paused at the exit to adjust her equipment configuration and review the terrain features she had memorized during months of studying topographical maps that most soldiers never bothered to examine. The first relay position lay 2 kilometers northeast along a ridgeline that would provide optimal signal propagation, but also exposed her to observation from multiple enemy positions. Dawn was breaking over Eagle Valley with the gray light that preceded sunrise in mountainous regions, creating visibility conditions that would make movement dangerous, but not impossible for someone small enough to use terrain features for concealment. Sarah had chosen her route based on calculations that balanced signal requirements against tactical considerations, identifying a path that would minimize exposure while maintaining access to the elevated positions necessary for long-range radio transmission. The route would take her through areas where enemy patrols were likely operating, but avoiding those areas would make the communication relay impossible to establish. Her first challenge came within minutes of leaving the tunnel exit. Enemy reconnaissance. Teams had positioned observation posts along the main ridgelines, using night vision equipment to monitor approaches to Fort Riverside and identify targets for artillery strikes. Sarah spotted the first position while moving through a stand of pine trees that provided cover but also limited her ability to see potential threats. 2 soldiers occupied a concealed position approximately 300 meters ahead, equipped with radio gear and optical equipment that could detect movement across several kilometers of open terrain. Sarah studied the enemy position for 20 minutes, timing the patterns of their observation routine and identifying gaps in their surveillance coverage that might allow her to pass undetected. The soldiers were disciplined and alert, maintaining proper watch procedures that suggested professional military training rather than irregular forces. But they were positioned to observe major approach routes rather than the difficult terrain that Sarah planned to traverse, and their attention was focused on areas where conventional military movement would be expected. Moving with the patience that Dr. Foster had taught her during equipment installation procedures, Sarah advanced through terrain that would have challenged experienced infantry soldiers. She used creek beds and rock formations to mask her movement, timing each advance to coincide with natural sounds that would cover any noise from her equipment or footsteps. Her small size allowed her to use concealment opportunities that larger soldiers would have found inadequate, and her technical training had taught her to move with the precision required for delicate equipment handling. The landscape between the tunnel exit and her first relay position consisted of mixed forest and rocky outcroppings that provided both opportunities and obstacles for concealed movement. Enemy forces had established patrol routes along obvious travel corridors, but they had not positioned sufficient personnel to monitor every possible approach through difficult terrain. Sarah's route took advantage of areas where steep slopes and dense vegetation made movement challenging but provided excellent concealment from observation posts positioned to watch more accessible areas. Reaching the first relay position required climbing a section of near-vertical rock face that would have been impossible for soldiers carrying standard field equipment. Sarah's modified gear was designed for minimal weight and maximum functionality, allowing her to ascend terrain that enemy forces would consider impassable for anyone attempting to carry communications equipment. The climb took 40 minutes of careful progress, with frequent pauses to ensure that her radio components remained properly secured and calibrated, despite the physical stress of vertical movement. The first relay position offered commanding views of Eagle Valley and excellent signal propagation characteristics, but it also provided minimal cover from enemy observation once radio transmission began. Sarah would have perhaps 10 minutes to establish contact with the second relay point before enemy direction-finding equipment could locate her position and call for artillery strikes or patrol interception. She had calculated transmission timing. That would allow coordination with the second relay while minimizing exposure, but the plan required precise execution under conditions that allowed no margin for error. Sarah unpacked her equipment with movements, practiced during countless hours of training that her supervisors had never observed. The portable radio components assembled into a system capable of signal amplification and directional transmission. That exceeded the capabilities of standard military field radios. Her modifications included frequency agility features that would make enemy interception more difficult and signal processing enhancements that could maintain clear communication. Despite atmospheric interference and electronic countermeasures, the technical complexity of establishing the first relay station required 15 minutes of careful equipment configuration, during which Sarah remained exposed to potential enemy observation from multiple directions. She worked with the concentrated focus that had characterized her approach to every technical challenge, testing signal strength and transmission quality while monitoring for signs of enemy response to her radio emissions. The equipment functioned exactly as she had calculated, providing clear communication capability across the first leg of her planned relay chain. Contact with Fort Riverside confirmed that the base was under sustained artillery bombardment and that enemy ground forces were advancing on the outer defensive perimeter. Colonel Parker's voice carried strain and urgency as he reported that conventional defensive positions would not hold against the coordinated assault currently developing. Sarah acknowledged the tactical update while simultaneously beginning transmission procedures to establish contact with the second relay position, knowing that time constraints were becoming critical as enemy forces prepared for their final assault phase. The second relay position lay 4 kilometers southeast along a different ridgeline that would provide the signal geometry necessary for reaching Allied communication stations outside Eagle Valley. Reaching that position would require crossing 2 areas of open terrain where enemy patrols were actively operating, followed by a climb through rocky terrain that would challenge even experienced mountaineers. Sarah had studied the route extensively, but theoretical knowledge would prove inadequate if she encountered unexpected obstacles or enemy forces that had modified their patrol patterns since her reconnaissance. Disassembling the first relay station required careful attention to equipment handling that would ensure functionality when she reached subsequent positions. Sarah's technical training emphasized procedures that maintained calibration and prevented damage during field operations, skills that proved essential when working under time pressure while potentially exposed to enemy fire. The equipment packed efficiently into her modified carrying system, distributing weight in ways that would not interfere with movement through difficult terrain. Movement from the first relay position toward the second required crossing a valley floor where enemy patrols had established regular routes designed to intercept anyone attempting to move between Allied positions. Sarah timed her crossing to coincide with a period when patrol schedules would create a gap in coverage, but she understood that enemy forces might have modified their patterns to account for tactical developments that had occurred since her initial route planning. The crossing would require 40 minutes of movement through terrain that offered minimal concealment opportunities. The valley floor consisted of meadow areas interspersed with stands of aspen trees that provided some visual concealment but would not stop observation by thermal imaging equipment that enemy forces might be using for night operations. Sarah moved in short rushes between concealment positions, pausing frequently to observe for signs of enemy activity before continuing toward the far side of the valley. Her movement technique emphasized stealth over speed, accepting longer transit times in exchange for reduced probability of detection. Halfway across the valley, Sarah encountered an enemy patrol that had not appeared in her timing calculations. 3 soldiers were moving along a creek bed that intersected her planned route, conducting what appeared to be a reconnaissance sweep designed to identify potential infiltration routes that Allied forces might use for counterattack operations. The patrol was moving slowly and systematically, checking areas where concealment was possible and maintaining radio contact with their command element. Sarah remained motionless in a cluster of fallen logs for 30 minutes while the enemy patrol completed their sweep of the immediate area. The soldiers demonstrated professional competence and tactical awareness that suggested they would detect any movement that occurred within their observation range. But their search pattern was designed to identify larger groups attempting coordinated movement rather than individual soldiers using extreme stealth techniques, and Sarah's small size allowed her to remain effectively invisible in concealment. That would have been inadequate for standard infantry operations. When the patrol moved beyond visual range, Sarah continued her crossing with increased caution, understanding that additional enemy forces might be operating in areas where her intelligence had not identified their presence. The remainder of the valley crossing required an additional hour of careful movement, with frequent pauses to ensure that she was not being followed or observed by enemy elements that might have detected signs of her passage. The approach to the second relay position involved climbing through terrain that consisted of loose rock and steep grades that would challenge even experienced climbers without heavy equipment. Sarah's route followed a series of ledges and crevices that provided concealment from observation but required technical climbing skills that she had developed through personal interest rather than military training. The ascent took 2 hours of sustained effort, with the constant stress of carrying delicate equipment through conditions that could easily result in damage or complete equipment failure. Reaching the second relay position occurred just as enemy artillery began targeting the area around Fort Riverside with increased intensity, suggesting that ground assault preparations were entering their final phase. Sarah could see smoke rising from multiple locations within the base perimeter and could hear the sustained sound of automatic weapons fire that indicated contact between enemy forces and defensive positions. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly, making successful completion of her communication relay mission even more critical for the survival of the garrison. The second relay station required different equipment configuration than the first position due to changes in terrain features and signal propagation requirements. Sarah's technical knowledge allowed her to adapt her radio setup for optimal performance under the specific atmospheric and geographical conditions that existed at the second location. The equipment modifications took 20 minutes to complete, during which time artillery strikes against Fort Riverside continued to intensify and enemy forces appeared to be advancing toward final assault positions. Establishing contact with both Fort Riverside and the third relay position required careful frequency management and signal timing that would prevent interference between transmission legs, while maintaining clear communication despite enemy electronic warfare efforts. Sarah's training in advanced communication procedures enabled her to coordinate multiple radio links simultaneously, creating an effective relay chain that extended Fort Riverside's communication range far beyond what should have been possible. With standard military equipment, the third relay position represented the most dangerous element of Sarah's mission plan. Located on the highest peak overlooking Eagle Valley, the position would provide signal propagation that could reach Allied communication stations 50 kilometers away, but it would also expose her to enemy observation and fire from multiple directions. Reaching the position would require crossing terrain that enemy forces might be using for artillery observation posts, and operating radio equipment from the exposed location would immediately reveal her presence to anyone monitoring radio frequencies. In the area, Colonel Parker's voice carried desperation when he reported that outer defensive positions were being overrun, and that enemy forces would likely breach the main perimeter within 2 hours. The base's ammunition supplies were being depleted faster than anticipated due to the intensity of the enemy assault, and casualties were mounting among the defenders who were attempting to hold positions against overwhelming numerical superiority. Without immediate air support and artillery assistance from Allied forces, Fort Riverside would fall before noon. Sarah acknowledged the tactical update while beginning preparations for movement toward the third relay position, understanding that her mission had become a race against time that would determine whether 800 soldiers survived the day. The route to the final position would take her through the most dangerous terrain she had yet encountered, past enemy positions that would certainly detect and engage her if she made any errors in movement or concealment. But the alternative was certain defeat for every soldier defending Fort Riverside. The ascent toward the third relay position began with a climb through terrain that enemy forces had definitely scouted and potentially occupied with observation. Posts designed to direct artillery fire against Fort Riverside. Sarah moved with extreme caution, using every available concealment opportunity, while maintaining awareness that enemy personnel might be positioned at any location along her route. The climb required technical skills that pushed the limits of what was possible while carrying radio equipment through near-vertical terrain. 2 hours into the ascent, Sarah encountered evidence that enemy forces had established positions along the route she was attempting to traverse. Fresh footprints in muddy areas indicated recent patrol activity, and radio intercepts suggested that enemy observation posts were coordinating artillery strikes from elevated positions that might include her planned relay location. The tactical situation had changed in ways that made her original plan extremely dangerous, but alternative approaches would require time that Fort Riverside no longer possessed. Sarah modified her approach to account for enemy presence while maintaining focus on reaching the relay position that would enable communication with Allied forces. The modification required using terrain features that would provide concealment, but also increase climbing difficulty and extend transit time. She accepted the additional risks while understanding that failure to establish the third relay link would make her entire mission unsuccessful and leave Fort Riverside without hope of survival. The final approach to the third relay position required movement across exposed terrain, where enemy observation was certain and immediate engagement was probable once her presence was detected. Sarah prepared her equipment for rapid deployment while planning movement techniques that would minimize exposure time and maximize the probability of successful radio transmission before enemy forces could respond with effective fire. The success of her mission would depend on precise execution under the most dangerous conditions she had yet encountered. Fort Riverside's defenders were running short of ammunition and medical supplies, while enemy forces prepared for what appeared to be their final assault phase. Sarah's communication relay represented the garrison's last hope for survival, but establishing the critical third relay link would require her to operate radio equipment from a position where enemy forces could observe and engage her with direct fire weapons. The mission had become a desperate gamble that would determine whether her months of preparation and technical expertise could overcome impossible tactical odds. The rocky outcropping that served as Sarah's final relay position jutted from the mountainside like a broken fist, offering commanding views of Eagle Valley, but providing virtually no protection from enemy fire once her radio transmissions began. She had reached the location through a grueling 4-hour climb that tested every limit of her physical endurance and technical skill, carrying equipment that represented Fort Riverside's last connection to the outside world. Below her, smoke columns marked the locations where artillery shells continued to pound the base's defensive positions, while enemy forces massed for what intelligence reports had warned would be an overwhelming final assault. Sarah crouched behind the largest boulder available, knowing that her concealment would disappear the moment she activated her transmission equipment. Enemy direction-finding capabilities would locate her position within minutes of radio contact, and the exposed nature of her location meant that accurate fire could be directed against her from multiple positions throughout the valley. She had perhaps 10 minutes to establish contact with Allied communication stations, relay Fort Riverside's tactical situation, and coordinate air support that could arrive before the base's defenses collapsed completely. The equipment assembly process required delicate handling of components that had been stressed by hours of movement through dangerous terrain. Sarah's technical training proved essential as she connected signal amplifiers, antenna arrays, and power systems that would enable transmission across distances that exceeded normal radio capabilities. Her modifications included frequency hopping sequences that would make enemy interception more difficult and signal compression techniques that would maximize information transfer during the brief window when transmission would be possible. Contact with Allied communication stations required precise frequency selection and signal timing that accounted for atmospheric conditions unique to high-altitude mountain environments. Sarah's months of studying advanced radio propagation theory enabled her to calculate optimal transmission parameters while working under extreme time pressure and constant threat of enemy detection. The equipment responded exactly as her technical specifications predicted, establishing clear communication links with Allied forces positioned outside the electromagnetic interference zone that enemy weapons had created around Eagle Valley. The voice that answered Sarah's transmission belonged to Major Patricia Wells, the communication officer at Regional Command South, who had been monitoring emergency frequencies without expecting to receive contact from Fort Riverside after 14 hours of communication blackout. Sarah identified herself and immediately began relaying tactical information that painted a desperate picture of the situation developing at the isolated mountain base. Fort Riverside was surrounded by enemy forces estimated at over 2,000. Personnel was running critically low on ammunition and medical supplies, and faced certain defeat without immediate air support and artillery assistance. Major Wells requested confirmation of Sarah's identity and authorization for transmitting tactical intelligence, standard security procedures that seemed absurd given the circumstances, but reflected protocols designed to prevent enemy deception. Operations. Sarah provided authentication codes that she had memorized during her communications training, along with technical details about Fort Riverside's defensive positions that only someone with access to classified tactical information would possess. The verification process consumed precious minutes, while enemy forces continued their preparations for final assault operations. Regional Command South had received no communication from Fort Riverside since the electromagnetic pulse attacks had severed normal radio links 14 hours earlier. Intelligence analysts had assumed that the base had been overrun during the initial enemy offensive, and no rescue operations had been planned because aerial reconnaissance had indicated that enemy forces controlled all approach routes to the isolated position. Sarah's transmission represented the first confirmation that Fort Riverside's garrison remained operational and was conducting organized resistance against overwhelming enemy superiority. The tactical information that Sarah relayed transformed Regional Command South's understanding of the battle developing in Eagle Valley. Fort Riverside's continued resistance was disrupting enemy timetables and preventing consolidation of territorial gains that would have opened southern supply routes to enemy exploitation. The base's strategic location made its survival critical for maintaining Allied control over the mountain passes that connected northern and southern operational areas. But providing effective assistance would require air support operations that had not been planned or prepared. Major Wells immediately initiated emergency procedures for coordinating close air support operations while maintaining communication links with Sarah's relay station. The process required contacting multiple command elements, verifying aircraft availability, and planning flight routes that would enable effective engagement of enemy forces surrounding Fort Riverside. Standard procedures for close air support coordination typically required hours of planning and preparation, but the deteriorating tactical situation demanded immediate action despite incomplete intelligence and hasty operational planning. Sarah monitored the communication traffic while maintaining her radio equipment under increasingly dangerous circumstances. Enemy forces had begun responding to her transmissions, with countermeasures designed to disrupt radio communications and locate transmission sources for targeting by artillery and direct fire weapons. Electronic jamming attempts created interference that required constant adjustment of her equipment configuration, while direction-finding operations threatened to pinpoint her location for immediate engagement by enemy observers positioned throughout the valley. The first indication that enemy forces had detected Sarah's position came from rifle fire that struck the rocks near her location, followed by more accurate shooting that suggested enemy marksmen had identified her general area and were attempting to eliminate the radio threat she represented. Sarah continued operating her equipment while bullets struck the boulder that provided her only protection, understanding that terminating communication would doom Fort Riverside's defenders to certain defeat. When enemy forces completed their final assault preparations, Regional Command South confirmed that close air support aircraft were being diverted from other operations and would arrive over Eagle Valley within 30 minutes. The aircraft consisted of 2 attack helicopters equipped with anti-tank missiles and automatic cannons, along with a ground attack aircraft capable of delivering precision strikes against enemy artillery positions and troop concentrations. Effective coordination of these air assets would require continuous communication, links that could provide target identification and damage assessment throughout the engagement. Sarah's position was becoming increasingly untenable as enemy forces concentrated fire against her location while simultaneously advancing toward Fort Riverside's final defensive perimeter. Rifle bullets were striking her protective boulder with increasing frequency and accuracy, and she could observe enemy personnel moving to positions that would enable direct engagement of her radio station from multiple directions. Maintaining communication would require exposing herself to enemy fire, but terminating contact would eliminate the guidance necessary for effective air support operations. The tactical coordination required for close air support operations involved continuous communication between Sarah's relay station, the incoming aircraft, and Fort Riverside's defensive command element. Sarah had to simultaneously maintain contact with multiple parties while providing target identification information based on her elevated observation position and the real-time tactical updates that Colonel Parker was transmitting from the besieged base. The complexity of managing multiple communication links under combat conditions tested every aspect of her technical training and operational experience. Fort Riverside's defensive situation had deteriorated significantly during the time required for Sarah to establish her relay communications. Enemy forces had breached the outer perimeter at 3 locations and were advancing toward the base's core facilities, while defenders fell back to secondary positions that offered limited protection against sustained assault. Ammunition supplies were critically low, medical facilities were overwhelmed with casualties, and combat effectiveness was declining rapidly as exhausted soldiers attempted to maintain organized resistance against overwhelming enemy pressure. Colonel Parker's tactical reports indicated that the base could not hold its current positions for more than 20 minutes without air support that could disrupt enemy assault preparations and provide relief from the constant artillery bombardment that was destroying defensive positions faster than they could be reinforced. The close air support aircraft represented Fort Riverside's only hope for survival, but effective employment of air assets required precise target coordination that depended entirely on Sarah's ability to maintain communication links despite increasing enemy pressure against her exposed position. The first close air support aircraft arrived over Eagle Valley with devastating effect against enemy positions that Sarah identified through her elevated observation point. Attack helicopters engaged enemy artillery positions with precision missile strikes that eliminated the constant bombardment that had been wearing down Fort Riverside's defenses throughout the morning. The immediate relief from artillery fire allowed the base's defenders to reorganize their positions and coordinate more effective resistance against enemy ground forces that had been advancing under cover of sustained bombardment. Sarah's target identification capabilities proved essential for maximizing the effectiveness of limited air support resources against enemy forces that were dispersed throughout difficult mountain terrain. Her technical knowledge enabled her to coordinate multiple aircraft operations simultaneously while providing precise target location information that resulted in successful engagement of enemy command elements, supply concentrations, and key defensive positions that had been supporting the assault against Fort Riverside. Enemy forces responded to the air attacks with increased efforts to eliminate Sarah's communication station, recognizing that her target coordination was enabling devastatingly effective employment of Allied air assets. Rifle fire against her position intensified, and she could observe enemy personnel attempting to maneuver into positions that would allow direct assault against her exposed location. Sarah continued operating her radio equipment while understanding that her survival depended on the air support operations that she was coordinating. The ground attack aircraft that arrived as the second wave of air support carried ordnance capable of engaging larger enemy formations that had been identified through Sarah's reconnaissance and Fort Riverside's tactical intelligence. Precision bombing attacks eliminated enemy supply areas, disrupted assembly points for forces preparing to assault the base, and created defensive barriers that prevented enemy reinforcements from reaching positions where they could support continued offensive operations against the isolated garrison. Communication coordination between Sarah's relay station and the various aircraft operating over Eagle Valley required technical expertise that exceeded normal military radio procedures. Sarah had to manage frequency conflicts, signal interference, and equipment limitations while providing continuous target updates and damage assessments that enabled pilots to maximize their effectiveness against dispersed enemy forces. Her advanced technical training and equipment modifications proved essential for maintaining the complex communication requirements that effective close air support operations demanded. The tactical situation began shifting in favor of Fort Riverside's defenders as air support operations disrupted enemy assault preparations and eliminated key offensive capabilities that had threatened to overwhelm the base's defensive positions. Enemy forces that had been advancing toward the main perimeter were forced to seek cover from air attacks, allowing Fort Riverside's defenders time to reorganize their positions and coordinate more effective resistance against reduced enemy pressure. Sarah observed significant changes in enemy behavior patterns as their commanders attempted to adapt to the unexpected appearance of Allied air support that was disrupting carefully planned assault operations. Enemy forces began dispersing into smaller groups that sought concealment in terrain features that would provide protection from air attack. But this dispersion reduced their ability to concentrate sufficient force for breakthrough operations against Fort Riverside's defensive positions. Regional Command South confirmed that additional air support assets were being redirected toward Eagle Valley based on the tactical intelligence that Sarah was providing about enemy force dispositions and operational capabilities. The success of initial air operations had demonstrated that enemy forces could be effectively engaged if accurate target information was available, transforming what had appeared to be an impossible defensive situation into a viable operation that could potentially save Fort Riverside's garrison. The complexity of coordinating multiple air support operations while maintaining communication with Fort Riverside and Regional Command South required Sarah to operate her radio equipment at maximum capacity despite increasingly dangerous conditions at her exposed relay position. Enemy marksmen had identified her location with sufficient accuracy to deliver sustained fire against her protective boulder, and she could observe enemy infantry moving to positions that would enable direct assault against her radio station. Sarah's technical expertise enabled her to maintain effective communication links despite equipment stress, atmospheric interference, and enemy electronic warfare efforts that were designed to disrupt radio operations. Her equipment modifications continued functioning within operational parameters that exceeded manufacturer specifications, providing communication capabilities that proved essential for coordinating complex air support operations under adverse conditions. Fort Riverside's tactical situation continued improving as sustained air support operations eliminated enemy capabilities that had threatened to overwhelm the base's defenses. Enemy artillery positions were being systematically destroyed. Assault formations were being dispersed by accurate air attacks, and command elements were being eliminated by precision strikes that disrupted coordination of offensive operations. The immediate threat to the garrison was diminishing, but Sarah's relay station remained essential for maintaining the communication links that enabled continued air support coordination. The enemy response to effective Allied air operations included increased efforts to eliminate Sarah's communication capabilities through direct action against her relay position. She could observe enemy personnel advancing toward her location with equipment that appeared designed for assault operations against fortified positions. The tactical situation had become a race between continued air support operations that were achieving decisive results against enemy forces and enemy efforts to eliminate the communication links that made such operations possible. Sarah made the decision to maintain her communication station despite increasing personal danger, understanding that terminating radio contact would eliminate the target coordination that was enabling successful air support operations. The technical complexity of her equipment and the critical nature of her mission required her personal operation of the radio systems, making her relay station irreplaceable for continued air support coordination that was saving Fort Riverside's garrison from certain defeat. Enemy forces launched their final attempt to eliminate Sarah's relay station through direct assault operations that would determine whether Fort Riverside would receive continued air support or face renewed assault by enemy forces that remained capable of overwhelming the isolated base. Sarah prepared to defend her position while maintaining radio operations that had become the critical link between Fort Riverside's survival and the air support capabilities that were systematically destroying enemy offensive capabilities throughout Eagle Valley. The enemy assault team approached Sarah's relay position with tactical precision that reflected professional military training and detailed reconnaissance of the terrain features surrounding her exposed location. 6 soldiers advanced through the rocky approaches using fire and movement techniques designed to suppress her position while closing distance for direct engagement of her radio equipment. Sarah could observe their methodical approach through gaps in the boulder formation that provided her only protection, understanding that her technical mission would end in failure if enemy forces succeeded in destroying her communication capabilities. Maintaining radio contact with the coordinated air support operations required Sarah to expose herself to increasingly accurate enemy fire while operating equipment that demanded precise technical adjustments under combat conditions. The complexity of managing multiple communication links simultaneously while enemy marksmen delivered sustained fire against her position tested every aspect of her training and determination. Her small size provided some advantage in utilizing minimal cover, but the exposed nature of her relay station made survival dependent on factors beyond her direct control. The tactical coordination of air support operations had reached critical importance as additional aircraft arrived over Eagle Valley with capabilities that could decisively defeat enemy forces threatening Fort Riverside. Close air support aircraft were engaging targets throughout the valley based on Sarah's real-time reconnaissance and target identification. But effective employment of air assets required continuous communication that could only be maintained if her relay station remained operational despite direct enemy action against her position. Sarah's radio equipment continued functioning despite bullet impacts against the protective boulder and electronic interference generated by enemy jamming attempts. Her technical modifications had included protective features that maintained operational capability under adverse conditions, but the equipment's durability was being tested beyond design specifications as enemy forces concentrated their efforts on eliminating the communication links that were enabling devastatingly effective air support operations against their assault forces. Regional Command South had committed additional air support resources to Eagle Valley based on the tactical success of initial operations and the strategic importance of maintaining Fort Riverside's control over critical mountain pass routes. The expanding air support commitment included ground attack aircraft with heavy ordnance capable of engaging large enemy formations, but coordination of multiple aircraft operations required communication capabilities that depended entirely on Sarah's ability to maintain her relay station under direct enemy assault. Fort Riverside's defensive situation had stabilized significantly as sustained air support operations eliminated enemy capabilities that had threatened to overwhelm the base's garrison. Colonel Parker reported that enemy artillery had been effectively neutralized, assault formations had been dispersed or destroyed, and the immediate threat to the base's survival had been substantially reduced. However, enemy forces remained capable of renewed offensive operations if air support coordination was disrupted by the destruction of Sarah's communication links. The enemy assault team had advanced to within 50 meters of Sarah's position, close enough to employ grenades and automatic weapons that could overcome the limited protection provided by her boulder shelter. Sarah continued operating her radio equipment while preparing for direct combat that would determine whether Fort Riverside received continued air support or faced renewed assault by enemy forces that retained sufficient strength to threaten the isolated garrison. Communication with the attacking aircraft revealed that enemy forces throughout Eagle Valley were attempting to withdraw from their assault positions, but organized retreat required coordination that air support operations were systematically disrupting. Sarah's elevated observation position enabled her to identify enemy movement patterns and coordinate airstrikes that prevented effective disengagement, trapping enemy forces in positions where they could be systematically eliminated by sustained air operations. The technical complexity of coordinating air support against dispersed enemy forces while managing multiple communication frequencies under combat stress demonstrated the advanced capabilities that Sarah had developed through months of independent study and equipment modification. Her ability to maintain effective radio operations despite equipment damage, atmospheric interference, and direct enemy fire exceeded the performance standards expected from standard military communication procedures. Enemy grenades began exploding near Sarah's position as the assault team attempted to eliminate her radio capabilities through indirect fire that would not require direct exposure to her defensive position. The explosions created additional equipment stress and generated debris that interfered with her radio operations, but Sarah's technical expertise enabled her to maintain communication links through rapid equipment reconfiguration and alternative antenna positioning that compensated for combat damage. The air support operations that Sarah was coordinating had achieved decisive tactical results against enemy forces that had appeared capable of overwhelming Fort Riverside through superior numbers and coordinated assault techniques. Enemy command elements had been eliminated, supply concentrations had been destroyed, and assault formations had been dispersed to the extent that organized offensive operations were no longer possible. The tactical situation had shifted from desperate defense to potential victory for Fort Riverside's garrison. Sarah's radio intercepts indicated that enemy forces were attempting to coordinate general withdrawal from Eagle Valley, but their communication capabilities had been severely degraded by air attacks against command positions and the electronic warfare effects of sustained combat operations. The lack of effective enemy coordination was enabling air support aircraft to engage retreating forces with devastating effectiveness, transforming what had been an organized assault into a chaotic retreat under constant air attack. Regional Command South confirmed that ground reinforcements were being deployed toward Eagle Valley to exploit the tactical success achieved through the air support operations that Sarah had coordinated. Allied forces positioned outside the valley were advancing along approach routes that had been cleared by airstrikes against enemy defensive positions, with estimated arrival times that would enable consolidation of tactical gains before enemy forces could reorganize effective resistance. The enemy assault against Sarah's position intensified as their commanders recognized that eliminating her communication capabilities represented their only remaining opportunity to disrupt the air support coordination that was systematically destroying their forces throughout Eagle Valley. Direct small arms fire was supplemented by rocket-propelled grenades that created increasingly dangerous conditions around her exposed relay station. But Sarah continued operating her radio equipment with determination that reflected her understanding of the critical importance of maintaining communication links. Sarah's technical training enabled her to adapt her radio configuration for continued operation despite progressive equipment damage and deteriorating environmental conditions around her position. Component redundancy features that she had incorporated into her equipment design provided backup capabilities that maintained communication effectiveness even when primary systems suffered combat damage, demonstrating the value of advanced preparation and technical innovation under extreme operational stress. The tactical intelligence that Sarah provided from her elevated observation position revealed that enemy forces were abandoning heavy equipment and attempting to withdraw through terrain routes that would minimize their exposure to continued air attack. This intelligence enabled air support coordinators to position aircraft for effective interdiction of enemy retreat routes, maximizing the tactical impact of limited air resources against dispersed enemy forces attempting to escape destruction. Fort Riverside's garrison had transitioned from desperate defense to active pursuit operations as the tactical situation shifted decisively in favor of Allied forces. Colonel Parker reported that his soldiers were advancing from their defensive positions to secure areas that had been abandoned by retreating enemy forces, consolidating territorial gains that would prevent enemy forces from re-establishing threatening positions around the isolated base. The enemy assault team reached Sarah's immediate position and began attempting to destroy her radio equipment through direct action that brought combat to point-blank range. Sarah defended her equipment while maintaining critical communication links that remained essential for coordinating ongoing air support operations against enemy forces attempting to withdraw from their failed assault. The outcome of direct combat around her relay station would determine whether the tactical victory achieved through air support coordination could be sustained through continued communication capability. Sarah's small size and technical focus had never included combat training beyond basic military requirements, but her determination to maintain communication links that were saving Fort Riverside's garrison motivated defensive actions that exceeded her formal preparation for direct combat situations. She utilized every available protective feature of her position while continuing radio operations that required precise technical attention despite the chaos of close-range combat. Air support aircraft continued engaging targets throughout Eagle Valley based on intelligence updates that Sarah transmitted despite direct enemy action against her position. The coordination of multiple aircraft operations under such conditions demonstrated communication capabilities that exceeded normal military expectations, reflecting the advanced technical preparation and equipment modification that had enabled Sarah's successful establishment of the relay links that proved decisive for Fort Riverside survival. The enemy assault against Sarah's position failed when air support aircraft responding to her coordinates delivered precision strikes against the attacking personnel, eliminating the immediate threat to her communication capabilities while demonstrating the integrated effectiveness of coordinated air and ground operations. Sarah's relay station had survived direct enemy assault, enabling continued coordination of air support operations that were achieving decisive results against enemy forces throughout the valley. Regional Command South confirmed that the tactical situation in Eagle Valley had shifted to complete Allied control, with enemy forces either eliminated or in full retreat under continued air attack. The success of air support operations coordinated through Sarah's communication relay had prevented the loss of Fort Riverside and enabled a decisive victory that maintained Allied control over critical mountain pass routes that enemy forces had attempted to capture through their coordinated offensive. Fort Riverside's casualties had been significantly reduced through the effective air support that disrupted enemy assault operations before they could achieve breakthrough success against the base's defensive positions. Medical personnel reported that the garrison remained combat effective with sufficient strength to maintain defensive operations and pursue retreating enemy forces, a tactical outcome that had seemed impossible during the early phases of the enemy offensive when communication links had been severed. Sarah's communication equipment had suffered substantial damage during the enemy assault against her position, but redundant systems and component backup features enabled continued operation of essential communication links with reduced capability. Her technical expertise proved sufficient for maintaining basic radio contact despite equipment degradation, ensuring that tactical coordination could continue as the situation transitioned from emergency defense to exploitation of tactical success. The air support operations that Sarah had coordinated were recognized by Regional Command South as decisive factors in preventing enemy capture of Eagle Valley and maintaining Allied control over strategic mountain pass routes. The tactical intelligence and target coordination that she provided from her exposed relay position had enabled effective employment of limited air resources against superior enemy forces, achieving results that standard tactical doctrine would have considered impossible under the circumstances. Dr. Emma Foster monitored communication traffic from her position at Regional Command South, recognizing the technical expertise and equipment innovation that had enabled Sarah's successful establishment of communication links under impossible conditions. The relay coordination demonstrated capabilities that exceeded conventional military communication procedures, reflecting advanced technical knowledge and preparation that had never been formally recognized by Fort Riverside's command structure. Colonel Parker transmitted personal recognition of Sarah's decisive contribution to Fort Riverside's survival, acknowledging that her independent action in establishing communication relay links had enabled the air support coordination that saved his garrison from certain defeat. The tactical situation had been transformed from hopeless defense to decisive victory through individual initiative that exceeded normal military expectations and demonstrated capabilities that had been consistently underestimated by command personnel. Sarah remained at her relay position throughout the day as tactical operations continued to eliminate remaining enemy forces and secure territorial control throughout Eagle Valley. Her communication coordination proved essential for managing the complex air and ground operations required to exploit tactical success and prevent enemy forces from reorganizing effective resistance in areas where they retained some capability. For continued operations, the extraction of Sarah from her exposed relay position required helicopter operations that demonstrated the extent to which tactical control had shifted in favor of Allied forces. Air support aircraft that had been engaging enemy forces throughout the valley were available to provide protective cover for extraction operations, reflecting the decisive success of the communication coordination that had enabled effective employment of air resources against superior enemy numbers. Regional Command South conducted immediate tactical assessment of the Eagle Valley operations, recognizing that the decisive victory had been achieved through communication capabilities that exceeded conventional military doctrine and equipment. Specifications. Sarah's technical innovation and personal courage had enabled coordination of air support operations that prevented enemy capture of strategic terrain and maintained Allied control over critical mountain pass routes. Fort Riverside's garrison emerged from their defensive positions to witness the extent of enemy equipment and personnel losses that had been achieved through the sustained air support operations that Sarah had coordinated from her exposed mountain relay station. The tactical results exceeded anything that conventional defensive doctrine would have predicted, demonstrating the decisive impact of effective communication coordination when air support resources were available for employment against enemy forces. The strategic implications of maintaining Fort Riverside's control over Eagle Valley extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation, preserving Allied supply routes and defensive positions that were essential for continued operations throughout the mountain region. Sarah's individual action in establishing communication relay links had prevented strategic losses that would have required extensive subsequent operations to recover territorial control and re-establish defensive positions. Sarah's equipment was carefully recovered and analyzed by technical personnel who recognized the advanced modifications and innovative features that had enabled communication capabilities far exceeding standard military specifications. Her technical expertise and equipment preparation represented capabilities that had never been formally recognized or utilized by Fort Riverside's command structure, despite their decisive importance for the base's survival during the enemy offensive. The formal recognition of Sarah's contribution to Fort Riverside's survival included recommendations for advanced technical training and assignment to positions that would utilize her demonstrated capabilities for complex communication coordination under adverse conditions. Military personnel who had previously questioned her suitability for field operations acknowledged that her technical expertise and personal determination had achieved results that exceeded the performance of conventional military units. Dr. Foster submitted detailed technical reports documenting the communication innovations that Sarah had developed and implemented, recommending integration of advanced relay coordination procedures into standard military communication doctrine. The success of Sarah's operations demonstrated that technical innovation and individual expertise could achieve tactical results that conventional military procedures would consider impossible under similar circumstances. Sarah Martinez returned to Fort Riverside as a soldier whose individual action had saved 800 lives and prevented strategic defeat that would have compromised Allied control over critical mountain territory. Her technical capabilities were finally recognized and properly utilized, but her quiet determination and willingness to act independently when institutional procedures proved inadequate had already demonstrated the qualities that define true military leadership under impossible conditions. The enemy forces that had appeared capable of overwhelming Fort Riverside through superior numbers and coordinated assault techniques had been decisively defeated through air support operations that were enabled by communication coordination that exceeded conventional military capabilities. Sarah's relay station had provided the critical link between desperate defense and decisive victory, transforming an impossible tactical situation through individual expertise and determination that formal military procedures had consistently underestimated. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.